Us going. Thank you. All right, so I'll start and welcome to Toxic Air Contaminant Review and Update Rulemaking. My name is Ben Duncan. I'll do a little bit more introduction later, but to kick us off, JR, I'd like to turn the mic over to you to start our conversation today.
Thanks, Ben. So good morning, everyone. My name is J.R. Giska, and I am the Cleaner Air Oregon Program Manager. I'd like to welcome you all here virtually today to kick the Rules Advisory Committee process off for the Toxic Air Contaminant Review and Update rulemaking. This is a vitally important rulemaking to ensure that DEQ is using the most up-to-date and representative science as the basis for our toxic air contaminant air quality standards. I also want to thank you all for serving as committee members for this rulemaking. Your time and commitment to reviewing and providing feedback on these proposed rules is greatly appreciated. And we know your engagement will lead to a more informed and robust outcome. As I mentioned, this rulemaking is to review and update rules that DEQ administers for its air quality programs. However, this rulemaking has required a robust collaboration between DEQ and toxicologists from the Oregon Health Authority, or OHA. Today, you'll be hearing from members of both agencies during this presentation. But before we move ahead, I would like to invite DEQ's Air Quality Administrator, Ali Mirzakhalili and Gabriella Goldfarb from Oregon DEQ. I'm sorry, from Oregon Health Authority. Excuse me. I'm going to turn it over. Excuse me. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, JR. It's early in the morning. The coffee will kick in soon. My name is Ali Mirzakhalili, and I am the Air Quality Division Administrator. And I too would like to welcome you all and thank you for agreeing to participate on this committee. This rulemaking team has done an excellent job of not only reviewing and developing the proposed rule updates, but also creating material specifically to assist you all with the task that as committee members. In today's kickoff meeting, you will hear from staff on the background of the rules and the proposed changes and the material that you all will be expected to review as part of this process. There are also supplemental material intended to assist you with the understanding of the proposed rules. Today's meeting is intended primarily as an introduction to all the rulemaking material and the processes. It is not intended as a space for robust discussion on the proposed rules themselves. That opportunity will come later in the future meetings. And we look forward to those discussions in the future, but welcome you today and invite you to ask clarifying questions of agency staff on the background material that's being presented to you. Again, as JR mentioned, this is a real partnership with OHA. And with that, I want to thank you all again and want to turn it over to Gabriella Goldfarb to give her introductory remarks. Thank you.
Because I'm muted. How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So thanks, Ali. Good morning to all of you contributing your time to this proposed rulemaking. I'm Gabriella Goldfarb, Environmental Public Health Section Manager in the Public Health Division of the Oregon Health Authority. And my section includes the state's public health toxicologists supporting DEQ, as JR mentioned, and also other natural resource agencies, local governments, and the public when questions arise about hazardous exposures to people through air, land, water, or fish. Dr. Holly Dixon, Dr. David Farrer are the core OHA toxicology team supporting Cleaner Air Oregon, and you'll be hearing from them both today. They've completed with a lot of care and a lot of intensive effort a tremendous body of information that's reflected in the proposed rules and in the explanatory materials they're going to help walk you through today. To give you a sense of that lift, they populated 20,000 cells of a spreadsheet capturing the relevance and quality of the science for 377 proposed toxic air contaminants. This is the first toxicity reference value update in the implementation of the Cleaner Air Oregon program. And at these inflection points, I reflect on what we had before CAO. which include recurring clashes and conflicts between industrial facilities and neighbors without a productive way to assess and answer questions about real health risks, and without a level playing field that sets the same rules for all facilities to meet. OHA's role here is to support a transparent and science-based process for the important economic contributions of industry to come with assurances to nearby residents, schools, and workers that the air is safe to breathe. As big as the lift has been for the folks on my team, they are paid to do this work. I think it's important to recognize the members of the Volunteer Air Toxic Science Advisory Committee. DEQ stood up with the concurrence of the Environmental Quality Commission, who were eminent experts who gave a lot of time and knowledge to provide independent review of the team's proposals to ensure they are based on robust and excuse me, credible science. As Ali mentioned, the focus today is just to walk you through all of this information, which is a lot. So thank you for undertaking this and your time, and I'll turn it back to JR to get into the presentation.
Thank you, Gabriella, and thank you, Ali. In addition to the DEQ and OHA staff presenting today, the RAC meetings will be facilitated by Kearns and West. And I'd like to introduce Ben Duncan, who will be the primary facilitator. He's already sort of introduced himself for these meetings. Ben and his team have also facilitated the technical advisory committee meetings held previously for this rulemaking and are familiar with much of the materials related to it. Before I turn it over to Ben, I would like to reiterate that today's meeting is a kickoff and intended really to provide an orientation to the rulemaking and the large amount of materials that have been made for you all for your review. So this means today we welcome clarifying questions on the material presented, but ask that we save in-depth technical questions for future meetings. So with that, I will turn it back over to Ben.
Thanks, JR. And maybe I'll just start right where you were finishing up. So I won't reiterate once again, right? But it's a good reminder as a kickoff meeting. Today is really about a shared foundation and grounding for the discussions that we're going to have together as this rulemaking process unfolds. And part of my role as a facilitator is to really hold our connection to our purpose, objectives, and the reasons for our really intentional agendas that we've set out. And I'll move to that part in a second. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to do a little bit of logistics. Make sure folks are all on the same page, particularly those, so we have panelists who represent our agency partners, our rulemaking members, and then we do have folks who are not as panelists, as members of the public. This is a Zoom webinar, and so only panelists, which will be those rulemaking advisory members and agency partners, as well as your facilitation team, will be able to contribute and speak during the meeting. I will ask, and folks are modeling really well, staying on mute when you're not talking, as obviously background noise can be distracting. Love that folks are on your cameras as much as possible. That's a really wonderful way to at least create the sense of being in person and being in community. And also for those in the public that love to see your names and faces as you do this really important work. These meetings are recorded. They will also be available on the RAC website. So after all of our meetings, we'll have meeting summaries, recordings. Those will all be captured, of course, with meeting materials on the RAC website. We do have closed captioning available if that's helpful for your participation. At the bottom of your screen, you should either see a CC button, or if you click on more, you should be able to get to a show captions on your screen. You'll also see, as we are in a virtual environment, for those of you as RAC members, the raise hand button, which is on the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little hand. Please use the raise hand button to get in the queue so we can track folks as we have our conversations. I will also accept your real live human hand as a way to get in the queue. So part of my job is to make sure that we get to hear from everyone. Raise hand button is really helpful. I'll note that for the public, chat is disabled and there is no Q&A for this meeting. So as we've been talking about, this is a kickoff meeting. This is a grounding, foundational meeting, a lot of data sharing. We will have public comment opportunities. Those are kind of informal public comment outside of the formal comment period. that attaches to all rulemaking, but we will have opportunities for public input in later meetings. The only thing that I would ask for you all, if you have technical challenges, you can direct message Angela Hesenius. Angela, if you want to wave to the group. She's doing multitasking. There she is, at least in my top corner, my colleague at Kearns and West. So she can help you if you're having any technical challenges. All I would ask for the use of chat, please do not use it as a way to have side conversations. And so we'll monitor that. Please be respectful of using the chat. If it's helpful for you to capture a thought or share information, we're not trying to use chat as a debate structure. Okay. Any questions about Zoom webinar? Not seeing any. Let's keep moving. So as we spend our time together, next 2 hours, 45 minutes or so, we're going to start with some introductions. We don't have a lot of time to really build relationship at this meeting, but I will ask you to think about, to name your name, your organization, and one thing that you're hopeful for in this process, just as a really quick grounding conversation for us, a little bit to introduce yourselves to each other. We will review the RAC charter. Hopefully folks in your meeting materials had an opportunity to spend some time with that. It's really around just making sure folks are going into this process, understanding the purpose, the roles and responsibilities, the way we're going to structure and move forward our meetings. So again, for clarity, if folks have questions after we walk through that, and then we'll spend the bulk of our time. Again, really grounding and some foundation setting for the rulemaking process itself. So you'll get a rulemaking overview, you'll get an update on the process, and then you'll get an orientation, a further deeper dive orientation into the materials that we'll be using as a starting point for all the rules conversations. We'll close our meeting with some next steps and get you out of here by 12 o'clock. So with that, we could probably take down the slides for a second. We'll do some introductions. Or is there an introduction slide? Doesn't matter. I'm going to start with our agency folks. So JR, I'm going to have you lead, if you will, an introduction of the DEQ team, and then maybe Gabriella ask you to help us introduce the Oregon Health Authority folks.
Sure. So I'm J.R. Giska. I'm the Clean Air Oregon Program Manager. You've heard from Ali Mirzakalili, our Air Quality Division Administrator. We have some other folks on here today. There's actually quite a few DEQ folks on here. There's only a couple that are speaking. And so I think maybe for today, for brevity, I'll just turn it over to Mike Polson right now to do an introduction. And I actually do want to turn it over, actually before Mike, I'd like to turn it over to Apple, just because Apple is our program coordinator here and is responsible, and you'll see her name all over all of the rule documents. And so I would like her to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, JR. Hi, everyone. My name is Apollonia Riberty. I'm the program coordinator for Cleaner Air Oregon. You can call me Apple. And as JR mentioned, I'm kind of your point of contact person from DEQ. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out to me, and I will get you connected to the folks that you need to be connected to. And I just want to say thank you so much for serving on the RAC and being here today. Thanks.
Thanks, Apple. Mike, you want to go ahead and go?
Hi, I'm Mike Polson. I'm a toxicologist, DEQ. I've been with DEQ in the cleanup program since 1999, doing risk assessments and risk guidance, and also participated in the original CAO rulemaking. The rules came out in 2018. So I've been with the CAO from the beginning.
Thanks, Mike. And like I said, there's several other DEQ members on here and a lot of people who've done a lot of work, but for brevity, I think we're going to go ahead and pass it over to OHA.
Thanks, folks. I will, without further ado, Holly Dixon is the lead toxicologist on our small but mighty OHA public health toxicologist team, and is the one who is pretty much exclusively dedicated to OHA, to DEQ, to Cleaner Air Oregon. Holly.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabriella. My name is Holly Dixon. I'm at Oregon Health Authority as a public health toxicologist. I've been working on updating these TRV proposals for a few years now. So I'm excited. And what I'm hopeful for in these meetings is to have a great discussion and to really share everything I've been working on and answer questions.
And then Dave Farrer, who has been with CAO before there was a CAO as we developed the program starting in 2016.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriella. I'm David Fair, toxicologist with Oregon Health Authority, and I was also like Mike. I was involved as the original program was being formed, and yeah, excited to present like what we've been working on for the last few years.
Great. Well, thank you. And then I guess if any other agency folks over the course of the meeting chime in to answer a question, just please introduce yourself at that point in time. So before we move to the RAC, just a reminder. So I introduced Angela Hesenius, myself, Ben Duncan with Kearns and West, and just to kind of put a finer point, we're really here as a third party neutral facilitation team, right? It's our job to ensure our meetings are productive and constructive, right? For those of you who have been in this work, we know that, while today is not that time for discussion and debate, we will have a lot of discussion and debate throughout this process. And part of my role is to make sure that those conversations are moving towards constructive and productive. And you'll hear me say that for the life of the time that we're together. How do we contribute in ways that are helping the state move forward on rules that really represent the best thinking of our state? So really appreciate you all being here. It's always a privilege and an honor to share this space. And hopefully I'll be able to fulfill that role in a really meaningful way. At any point during this process, I'll just say, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Angela Hesenius, or through our DEQ partners to let us know if there's things that are working, not working, feedback, et cetera. We're here to make sure this process works for you and works, of course, for the agencies responsible for putting together rules. So with all that said, I'm going to just call on folks, name, organization, or affiliation, or community you're representing, and then just one thing that you're hopeful for. And we got a number of folks. We want it to be brief, and we didn't want it to just be a roll call. So please, this will be the first test of honoring the ask. So something brief that you're hopeful for as we go through this process. I'm going to call on folks just in the order that I have it in a list, in no particular order, no priority, no special ordering of this naming. So I'm going to start with, and forgive me if I butcher your name, so you can help me if I do learn how to say it better next time. Travis Quarles.
Yeah, hi, I'm Travis Quarles. I'm with the Bridgewater Group. It's now part of Trinity Consultants. And so I do a lot of air permitting and risk assessments on behalf of industrial clients. And I'm interested in this process being productive back and forth, where we can, maybe make some changes where changes are necessary to make sure that the program truly reflects good science. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Travis. I appreciate you using productive, really reinforcing the ask here. Thank you. Welcome. Good to meet you. Charla Moffett.
Good morning, Charla Moffett. I handle the energy, environment, and transportation portfolios at Oregon Business and Industry, and just here to participate, have a more robust discussion of the scientific underpinnings of this rulemaking, and hopefully get to a better place.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. And we'll certainly have some time today to talk about some of the scientific underpinning as a baseline. Jeffrey, I'm going to say Tikanor.
Hi, my name is Jeff Titchener.
Titchener, thank you.
No worries. I appreciate being on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and to working with the group. My hope for the rulemaking is that by the end, we will all appreciate its scope, such that DEQ and EQC can understand the impact of the rules that they're asking EQC to adopt on the regulated community before that happens.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. Jim Spar.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. My name is Jim Spar. I'm with Cascade Steel Rolling Mills in McMinnville. My hope for this process is to continue a collaborative and productive relationship between DEQ and the regulated community.
Good. Thank you, Jim. Cassandra Jackson.
Cassandra Jackson. I'm with the Port of Portland, and yeah, I'm hopeful that we can come to understanding a little bit more about the TRVs and establishment and participate really in a meaningful and effective rulemaking.
Thank you, Cassandra. Crystal Weston.
Hi, everyone. I'm Crystal Weston with Oregon Environmental Council. And for this process, I really hope to support a robust process that protects health and also leads to accountable implementation.
Good. Thank you, Crystal. Jonah Sanford.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonas Sanford. I'm the Executive Director of the Northwest Environmental Defense Center here in Portland. And I'm hopeful that this process is able to move forward effectively and efficiently, consistent with the timelines laid out in the OARs.
Thank you, Jonah. Jilali Torres.
Hi, my name is Ciclali Torres. I am with Verde. We're an environmental justice organization working to build environmental wealth in our communities through social enterprise outreach and advocacy. I myself am a lifelong Oregonian committed to environmental justice. I look forward to serving on this RAC, and my intention is to, one, get familiar with materials in order to understand it enough to be able to demystify these concepts and improve accessibility for others to participating in decision-making processes, particularly those who are experiencing injustices and disproportionate exposures. And two, to maintain the purpose and intention of the Cleaner Air Oregon program. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. Molly Kyle.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Molly Kyle. I'm a professor down at Oregon State University in the College of Health. My background is as an environmental epidemiologist and an environmental health researcher, so I'm very excited to actually see how the science gets translated into this type of practice. Nice to meet everybody.
Nice to meet you. Mary Pivotal.
Good morning, Mary Pivotal, Neighbors for Clean Air. I was really excited to hear Gabrielle Goldfarb's opening remarks, reminding us of the context of sort of where Cleaner Air Oregon came from. And so, and it's nice to see David Farr and actually Molly Kyle, your role at EQC during the time of adoption of these rules. So what I'm really excited about in this process is I do believe the TRVs are the heart and soul of the Cleaner Oregon program and the promise that the state would continue to incorporate the best science as it understands risk and and so that we have a way, as Gabrielle reminded us at the beginning, to really deal with the concerns of communities and the ongoing process of permitting facilities in our community. So I'm very excited. I was concerned about delays in this regarding the original statutory requirements of the program. I'm glad to see this on track, concerned about delays, but just want to participate so that we can move this forward.
Good, thanks, Mary. Nadege Dubuisson. See if I got that okay.
You nailed it, Ben. Thanks. Nadege Dubuisson, she, her, and I'm a program supervisor on our Healthy Homes and Communities team in environmental health at the Multnomah County Health Department. And my hope for us is to just refamiliarize ourselves with the best available science, make sure it's clear for everybody, and to move us forward in a timely way that brings us back to the original intention of why CAO was brought to Oregon. So thank you.
Thank you. Kathleen Johnson.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Kathleen Johnson, she, her pronouns. I'm with Washington County in the Public Health Division. I lead our community environmental health programs. That includes air quality. My hope for this Rules Advisory Committee, I think it's been said a few times, but really making sure that we're grounding ourselves in public health science, and having that reflected in any rule update to ensure that this program is working as it is, as it should, which is a public health protection program. So that's it for me. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Dr. Kohlberg.
Good morning. I'm Patsy Kohlberg. I'm here representing Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I'm hopeful of a couple things. One is to support the scientific basis for the CAO work, but I'm also hoping to find out how the CAO program can better, or how we in the community, I work with a number of community groups on air quality issues in Portland, and how we might be able to better partner with CAO as we address the concerns that we have in the community.
All right, thank you. Ryan Ramage.
Hi, I'm Ryan Ramage with Valley Environmental. We operate an air curtain burner out here in Oregon, one of the main companies. So with that, we have a lot of rule changes that I'm looking forward that we can work on changing, so to help improve our industry, but also help improve our air quality in our communities. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Beth Ryder.
Hi, I'm Beth Ryder. I work with Trinity Consultants, helping with air quality for industrial clients. And I'm hoping kind of to best understand the process and scientific rigor that we're going through to best support environment, health, and economics.
Great, thank you. John Bird.
Hello, John Bird here with Roseburg Forest Products. My hope for this process is to improve efficiency where possible for DEQ staff and industrial facilities that go through the process of Clean Air Oregon.
Awesome. I think I got everybody. Did I miss any rulemaking advisory members? I think we're good. Okay. Charlotte, did you have a question?
Ben, you didn't include me. I'm Deborah Proctor.
Oh, sorry, Deborah Proctor.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's all I was going to ask. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I'm a toxicologist and risk assessor, and I have been working with a number of industries within Oregon and the Oregon Business and Industry Group. I have been able to spend some time looking in detail at a very small fraction of the TRVs that have been proposed. Substantial amount of work put forward, and applaud everybody's work. And my objective with participating is really to be able to engage in the methodologies used to develop the TRVs, and just to make sure we can that we're using the state of the science and ensuring protection of public health with these actions. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks for jumping in. Sorry to leave you in the lurch there. It won't happen again.
No worries.
So, yeah, let me make one last call, make sure I didn't miss anybody else. Charlotte, is that all you were calling out? Okay.
Yes, that was it. Sorry.
All right. Thanks for your help. All right, JR, I think it's back to you to move us into the charter conversation and keep the agenda going.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks, everybody, and thanks for those introductions and kind of what we're hoping to get out of this. So we're going to dive right in here to the first item. So the RAC Charter is an important document that DEQ provides whenever rules advisory committees are convened for rulemakings. It sets out the expectations and guidelines for how all members, agency staff, and facilitators will work together during this process. DEQ provided the charter ahead of this meeting with the other materials for members to review, and as noted in that communication, the expectation is that we have all reviewed the charter ahead of this meeting. We'd like to hear from you if there are any clarifications or questions on the components of the charter to ensure we are all aligned on how we will move through these meetings together. You can see a number of those pieces here on the slide. But before we pause for those questions, I'd like to talk a little bit about the scope of this committee in a bit more detail. So next slide. The primary function of this committee is to provide discussion and feedback on the proposed rules. This includes a number of lists and tables that DEQ uses for reporting and regulating toxic air contaminant emissions. We will spend the majority of this meeting introducing, as well as some of introducing this material, as well as some of the minor proposed rule language updates. This scope also includes providing feedback on the fiscal impacts of the proposed rules to this program, including a discussion of how DEQ proposes to implement the new standards if adopted. The scope of this committee is not to serve as a technical advisory committee, providing in-depth technical discussions with DEQ and OHA on the scientific basis used for developing the proposed standards values. Committee members will be welcome to share their ideas and generate productive discussions on the proposed values and underlying review methodology used to develop them. But these discussions will be facilitated amongst the committee members themselves. DEQ and OHA will provide clarification and may elect to answer some questions related to decisions and methodologies used, but again, will not engage in substantive, highly technical scientific arguments about proposed values during these meetings, as this was the primary focus of the Air Toxics Science Advisory Committee convened for this rulemaking. You'll hear more about that committee later. And finally, these meetings are not considered a formal public comment period. That will be held after the public hearing for these rules, which will come after these meetings conclude. We will, however, allow for public comment during the subsequent RAC meetings so that the RAC members can incorporate public feedback into their discussions as applicable. I will now turn it back over to Ben to facilitate any questions related to the RAC charter and scope.
Great, thanks, JR. So any comments, questions, reflections? Yeah, Jeff?
Hi, and thank you very much, DEQ, for the thoughtful charter and for the opportunity. I guess as a matter of process, I think it would be very helpful for the entire Rulemaking Advisory Committee to get a better feel from OHA and DEQ as to when it will and how it will be appropriate to engage in substantive, highly technical discussion. Although the ATSAC was convened to host ideas from OHA and DEQ, the ATSAC process was not open to the public and did not include a public component. So at this point, if the RAC is not to do that discussion here, I wonder where that discussion can occur.
Thanks, Jeff. JR, is that your question? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's for me. So thanks, Jeff. That's a great question. So really the hope here for us is that the heavy lifting on the scientific discussion has been had with the ATSAC. We're going to walk through a lot of materials today that will hopefully help folks review and understand what that process was like and what went into that process, and sort of those pieces where folks might have deep science questions. And so what we hope here is that the methodologies that we've done, that we've presented to the ATSAC are things that we can have conversation on. If there are deep science questions that you'd like us to review, I think really the formal public comment period with written comment is the time where we would welcome that. And I think we said this, during the ATSAC, that if there are questions that come to DEQ and OHA that sort of get us in a place where we'd like to go back to ATSAC and ask them for their feedback on some of those questions, we did make that commitment to do that. So I think for us, the best time to make those comments is in the formal comment period. But I'll turn it over to I don't know, Holly or Dave, if you've got any other thoughts on that.
Anything to add, Holly, or?
If not, that's fine. If not, that's fine also.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and Jeff, we'll track. I mean, thank you, JR. I mean, I think drawing a distinction between this not being a technical committee, but knowing that there is science as an underpinning for all of the conversations we're going to have, somewhere between those two things is we'll try to find the right mix. I appreciate you naming it, Jeff. JR, I think once we get through the grounding today, right, there might be some specific questions that folks have around methodology or kind of conclusions that were recommended from the ATSAC group. So, maybe Jeff, come back to that question later on, and we'll kind of test it through process to make sure that we're finding kind of the right balance between really kind of how the science is contributing to rules and the science itself. We're not kind of going back to run the ATSAC committee through this RAC, if that makes sense. Jeff, did you want to just add anything else?
Just to thank you both.
Yeah, appreciate it. Charla?
Well, I just want to add, I agree with Jeff's comments, and I think that the expectation going into this was that there would be a scientific discussion, so that's a pretty significant process issue right out of the gate. And there really was not a public process around when the ATSAC was meeting, and so I do have some concerns about how that really gets incorporated. And I think that we're just going to have, it's going to be difficult to move forward in this process if we're not going to talk about the science.
Yeah, and so JR and T, can you jump in?
I'll jump in on that. And so, yeah, Charlotte, so I appreciate that, and thanks for flagging it. I don't think the intent is to not have a scientific conversation. I think, to Ben's point, striking that right balance is going to be what we're seeking to do here. There's a lot of pieces about process here and the methodologies that were used and the sources of information. And I think, in our RAC meetings 2 and 3, we anticipate discussions. I know and later today, we're going to sort of flag that, some RAC members have already presented some of that scientific information that we will be posting for folks to review, and we will ask others if they have information they'd like us to consider for RACs 2 and 3. I think what I really need to say is that there are some limitations of how deep we can go into the toxicological weeds with a lot of a very general RAC committee here. And so we will be getting into those discussions. There's just a level setting expectation here that I don't know if we're,
Well, I guess, JR, we need some assurance that because when I hear DEQ say what we're going to do is that's best heard in a formal public comment period, the rule will have been written by that time. And what we observe is over and over is that those comments really are not taken to heart. And so the time to have those conversations would have been to have a more public process. So I have to lay down that concern going into this rulemaking, and I think it is a major one. And I will stop there, but
no, that's fair.
We need to address this in some way.
I appreciate that, and I do think we have made the commitment that if we do get substantive comments that have us going back and wanting to really review some of the proposals, that we would go back to ATSAC as needed. So
yeah, so Mary and then Crystal and then Charlotte, Jeff, to your comments already. I mean, so we are going to have a pretty lengthy conversation that kind of looks back to the ATSAC process and methodology. And so, some of these questions maybe come back towards the later part of our meeting. I understand what your general point is. Obviously, the science is a baseline for this conversation. So it's not an absence of conversation. We're not going to go kind of relitigate what ATSAC has completed, but if there are places where it's really important to dive in, we'll figure out how to hold that space. But we are going to have a lot of conversation with OHA kind of reflecting back on that process. So I'd ask if there are kind of very specific questions around the science, methodology, conclusions, et cetera, that maybe we come back later in this meeting and ask those questions. Yeah, Charlotte, jump back in.
Yeah, I think that's fine. No one's trying to relitigate anything. I don't think anything was litigated to begin with. So, and it's because there wasn't a public process around,
Sure.
When the ATSAC was meeting. So that's the issue, and I think that OHA just need to grapple with how they're going to incorporate a more robust, scientific review. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, Charlotte. Let's go, Mary, and then Crystal.
Thank you. I just feel like I have to weigh in to just say that community is looking for the same assurances of robust, objective scientific incorporation being the heart and soul of Clean Air Oregon. And I would say that this was established, back in 2018 when the rules were adopted, and by statute in terms of understanding. And this was a massive shift, and it was a core principle of this program was to allow for a scientific process to reconfigure the way ATSAC was, because prior to that, it had not been an objectively scientific process to review the risk levels. So I just be very concerned about, undermining that key principle of what Clean Air Oregon is. I will say the ATSAC went through a very public process last year. There were, I think, 6 meetings as this was all ruled out, and that is where these recommendations came from. I don't think by any means this was done in a closet. And so I just want to ensure that OHA, or I'd like the assurances for the community from OHA and DEQ that we will continue to follow the principles of the Clean Air Oregon program, which was to create a very, objective way to bring the most up-to-date science in to establish the benchmarks, the health benchmarks for this program. So I'm be a little bit concerned if we reevaluated how that was done. That was a cornerstone of developing the Clean Air Oregon program, was to decide how science would be brought in. And I think that DEQ and OHA, while it's taken you longer than I think you were also required to do, I think that you met the requirements as was outlined in the original statute.
Yeah, thank you. So Mary, let's hold that. Crystal, I want to come to you, and then Ali, I see your hand up. So I know folks are merging into a conversation that I think would be helpful maybe to revisit later in this discussion as we're focused on the charter. But Crystal, let's ask you to jump in. Ali, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And then I guess I'll ask if there's any specific questions around the charter and really move into kind of a process conversation around what can move forward. Crystal?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. I just want to express my appreciation for the underlying scientific work that was already done. And I look forward to continuing to discuss the science to make sure it serves the public health.
Great. So Ali, I'm going to ask you maybe to, hearing kind of the comments here, because certainly there seems to be some concern that we will never talk about science, and I don't think that was the way it was meant to be communicated or heard. Right? Science is the underpinning. Yeah, Ali, jump in.
Correct. Thank you, and again, I appreciate the request here, the point that's being raised about having an opportunity to actually talk about the science, and I think that's one of the intents of the RAC. And I think to JR's point, striking the balance here is important. But I'm hearing the request. I heard you, and I think we'll make room for that. And you'll see in the future RAC meetings there's going to be plenty of opportunity to dive into it. But I just want to also make the record clear here. I think Mary touched on that the ATSAC process was a public process. We even entertained a petition process, and as part of that from the public, and we addressed that. I think so. That was it wouldn't be an appropriate characterization to say it didn't involve a public discussion. So I just want to make sure that's addressed, and I think in here moving forward, and I just want to make sure we can assure the RAC members that we will. I heard you, and we'll make sure there's room for that discussion in this, and you'll see some of the material that we're presenting. We already had some material that's been filed with us, and we intend to share that with the RAC members and have a conversation around it. So. It is part of the plan. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Ali. Gabriella?
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore there's a lot of material to get through, which Ben, I'm sure you're anxious to steward us through. that is intended to get everybody on the same page, and so that the spring RAC meetings will be the time to bring all that information. And that is certainly a central role of the RAC, is to bring to the agencies information that folks believe has not been reflected or considered. And so that I see as the main focus for several RAC meetings in the spring.
Okay, thanks. Well, Gabrielle, you said what I said, or what I wanted to say is, let's move into it, right? I'm not hearing, kind of specific things around the charter. It's really how that charter is going to be applied in our process. And that's where some of the concerns are. So I'm going to ask that we move into the conversation to get into, I think, where people really are chomping at the bit to go. So JR, let's move through some background process, and then let's get our OHA folks talking about some of the science. Yep.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. And thanks everyone for those comments. Please keep them coming. For this section of the meeting, we're going to go into the background of the rules related to reporting and regulating toxic air contaminants in Oregon. We'll then discuss the current rulemaking and break down the major components that this committee will be reviewing. Next slide. So to understand why we are holding this current rulemaking, I want to present a brief overview and recent history of the rulemakings related to toxic air contaminants. The Clean Air Oregon program rules were adopted by the Environmental Quality Commission, or EQC, DEQ's governing body, in November of 2018. These rules established DEQ's toxic air contaminant regulatory program that requires commercial and industrial facilities to assess potential health risks to the public from emissions used for required emissions reporting of both the health and regulatory standards used in the program. In April 2020, the EQC adopted hazard index rules. This was a high
Is it just me, or is
technical rulemaking where DQ and OHA
JR, I think you're coming in and out. Is that just me?
No, it's not just you, Ben.
Okay, JR, you might need to go camera off, and let's see.
Am I back?
You are, but you've been kind of going glitchy. You're glitchy.
Okay. It's been a little spotty. Is it back now?
Yeah, maybe I'll ask folks if maybe everybody go off camera. Jerry, you might have to go off camera, but let's just try to limit bandwidth, maybe. See if that helps.
Is this better? Am I back?
So far.
Okay. Where did I drop off?
I think you got to start all over again.
Fantastic. To understand why we are holding this current rulemaking, I want to present a brief overview and recent history of the rulemakings related to toxic air contaminants. The Clean Air Oregon program rules were adopted by the Environmental Quality Commission, or EQC, DEQ's governing body, in November of 2018. These rules establish DEQ's toxic air contaminant regulatory program that requires commercial and industrial facilities to assess potential health risks to the public from emissions of toxic air contaminants from their production activities. They included a list of contaminants used for required emissions reporting and tables of both the health and regulatory standards used in the program. In April 2020, the EQC adopted the CAO Hazard Index rules. This was a highly technical rulemaking where DEQ and OHA determined criteria that would be used to adjust benchmarks for some chemicals for existing sources performing a risk assessment under the CAO program. There's a fact sheet that we've provided for this rulemaking that explains this in more detail. And finally, and most importantly for our discussions, the EQC adopted the Air Toxics Alignment and Update rules in November of 2021. These rules established a new toxic air contaminant standards division, Division 247. Both the reporting list of contaminants and the health standards that were previously contained under the CAO program rules were migrated to this new division, along with the rules providing for the review and update of these values, as well as rules regarding the Air Toxics Science Advisory Committee. The regulatory standards remained in the CAO program rules, as those values are specifically only applied to regulating sources under that program. We will hear much more about the reporting list, the health-based standards, and the regulatory standards for the remainder of this meeting. But first, just a bit about this current rulemaking before we dive into those items. Next slide. So the rules in Division 247 require a periodic review and update to the health standards for toxic air contaminants. Currently, this frequency is set at every 3 years in rule. When the health standards are revised, this automatically requires updates to the regulatory values used in the CAO program, as those values are developed directly from the health standards in Division 247. The rules also provide the process for reviewing and updating the standards, which includes a list of authoritative sources to review for updates. The rules also allow for members of the public to petition DEQ to make updates to specific standards. As I mentioned, the rules also provide for the establishment of an Air Toxics Science Advisory Committee, or ATSAC, to support the review and update process. This committee provides technical review of the science used to develop the proposed updates to the standards, but serves only in a consultative role and is not ultimately decisional when developing the final proposed values. The ATSAC meetings and process phase of this rulemaking concluded earlier this year. Next slide. Due to the highly technical nature of this rulemaking, the process was split into 2 phases. The first being the technical review, and the second being the formal rulemaking process, including these committee meetings, a public hearing and comment period, and concluding with the presentation of the proposed rules to the EQC for adoption. The first phase of this process was extremely time and resource intensive and was driven by our partners at OHA. This includes development of the proposed health values, convening the ATSAC meetings, and incorporating feedback from ATSAC into revising the proposed values as applicable. Dr. Holly Dixon from OHA will be presenting today on all aspects and materials from this phase of the process. As you can see, we are now in the formal rulemaking phase of the process in the RAC meetings. So let's dig into the content of this current rulemaking and what we will all be discussing in these meetings. Next slide. Primarily, we will be discussing the lists and tables indicated by the 3 boxes on this slide. The toxic air contaminant priority list is the list of contaminants the DEQ uses for monitoring and reporting of emissions. This will be referred to throughout our meetings as the priority list. As mentioned previously, there are 2 tables of values we will be discussing. The first is the table of toxicity reference values, or TRVs, which are the health standards for toxic air contaminants in Division 247. And the second is the table of risk-based concentrations, or RBCs, that are the regulatory standards used in the CAO program, which are based on the TRVs. In addition to these topics of discussion for this rulemaking, we're seeking feedback on a few other important items. DEQ is proposing changes to the rule language itself regarding the frequency at which we are required to review and update these standards, and allowing for flexibility when adjusting some of the RBCs in special cases when performing a risk assessment. And finally, we will be spending time during these meetings to discuss the proposed implementation plan for these rules, which is not part of any proposed rule changes, but is an important consideration related to the fiscal impacts of this rulemaking. For the rest of this section of the meeting, we'll be walking through the background on the priority list, TRVs, and the RBCs. And I will start that discussion on the priority list before turning it over to others. Next slide. So the priority list contains the list of contaminants that are known or suspected to cause harm when inhaled, and is based on information from primary sources listed in rules in Division 247. This includes sources from the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and agencies in both California and Washington State, as well as DEQ's own reporting lists from other programs. This list provides facilities with the list of contaminants that they are required to use to report their emissions of toxic air contaminants. Additionally, it is also used by DEQ's ambient monitoring group when assessing ambient monitoring data on toxic air contaminants. In regards to the regulatory emissions reporting for facilities, this list enhances the reporting of contaminants beyond what is required under the Federal Clean Air Act. Those requirements are only required, are limited to, the 6 criteria pollutants and the 188 hazardous air pollutants. To include other pollutants, excuse me, this list is expanded and enhanced to include other pollutants beyond those that can potentially lead to negative health effects for the public. Coupled with the periodic statewide air toxics emissions inventory that facilities are required to submit every 3 years, this priority list allows DEQ to understand how sources of TAC emissions can change in the state over time. Of the 3 items, the priority list casts the widest net and includes the most contaminants. This is because, although we require emissions reporting for all the contaminants on the list, not all of these contaminants currently have sufficient toxicological information to develop health standards. This means that the TRV and RBC tables contain fewer contaminants than this list. I will now turn it over to Dr. Holly Dixon from OHA to walk through the background on the development of the TRV proposals, which OHA took the lead role in.
Awesome. Thanks, JR. Go to the next slide. Perfect. So I'll start with some high-level background information and definitions, and then we'll get into more specifics later on today. But the reason we care about toxic air contaminants, it's because they can cause a wide range of health problems, also called health effects. And different contaminants, they can target different organs and systems in the body. So, for example, a contaminant someone breathes may specifically cause problems in the lungs and heart. Health problems from contaminant exposures fall into 2 main types. This is cancer and non-cancer health effects. So cancer is a family of diseases where cells grow uncontrollably and spread. There are more than 100 different types of cancer. Non-cancer is this other category and includes health problems other than cancer. So these are things like breathing problems, heart disease, and impaired brain development. So on this next slide, talk about how we assess these categories separately in toxicology. And we do this because they follow different principles and different assumptions. With non-cancer, we assume there's an amount of exposure to the contaminant that is too low to cause health problems. We call this a threshold amount. And toxicologists use scientific research studies in animals and people to determine this threshold for non-cancer. In contrast with cancer, we assume there's no amount of exposure to a cancer-causing contaminant that is free of risk. In other words, even a very low exposure to the contaminant can slightly increase the risk of cancer. So to evaluate the potential for cancer risk in a population, acceptable cancer risk target levels are set at very low levels, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. So to understand what air contaminant exposure means for health, we use toxicity reference values, which we call TRVs, and you'll hear me talk a lot about today. As JR previously mentioned, DEQ's TRVs are listed in Oregon Administrative Rule. Non-cancer and cancer TRVs, they have different definitions, as you can see here. And they have these different definitions because of the different principles that I just talked about on the last slide. So, non-cancer TRVs are the amount of an air contaminant that a person can breathe without health problems. If exposure is above the non-cancer TRV amount, toxicologists then review the exposure closely to make conclusions about health. Moving on to cancer TRVs, agencies set these TRVs at contaminant amounts low enough that no more than 1 additional person per 1 million people could develop cancer over a lifetime. So this is a level of risk so low that scientists would not be able to detect it in a population of people because it would not stand out from the background rates of cancer. And by background rates of cancer, I mean cancer caused by all other factors, things like genetics, age, lifestyle, and other contaminant exposures. I also want to highlight here on this slide that TRVs, they're designed to protect the health of everyone, including those who may be especially sensitive to contaminant exposures. So this includes populations such as children, pregnant people, and people with health issues. I also want to point out here that each contaminant can pose risk in more than one category. So a contaminant can have up to 3 different inhalation TRVs. So they can have one for cancer, And then there can actually be two different non-cancer TRVs, which I'll focus on the next slide. So as I just mentioned, each contaminant can have up to two different non-cancer TRVs. One is for short-term exposure, which we call acute, and one is for long-term exposure, which we call chronic. So while the length of acute exposures would be described on a clock, the other category, chronic, could be described with a calendar. So in Oregon, acute TRVs are intended to be health protective for exposures that last up to 24 hours. And chronic non-cancer TRVs, they're intended to be health protective for a year or more of exposure. And on this next slide, I'll go over the different sources we use for updating DEQ's TRVs. So here's that list of sources that DEQ considers to be authoritative in terms of their scientific rigor and comprehensive methods for producing TRV information. And we call these the authoritative sources. And these are listed in rule, and they're also listed on this slide. So these include the U.S. Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, the California Environmental Protection Agency, which is Cal EPA, and also Oregon DEQ in consultation with the Air Toxic Science Advisory Committee, ATSAC. So this last authoritative source was added to the list in 2021, and I'll share more details about this authoritative source as well as ATSAC in the next section of our presentation. So on the next slide, I wanted to zoom out for a minute and just talk about how DEQ, their TRVs are important for DEQ air quality programs overall. So for example, TRVs are used in DEQ's air toxics monitoring program. So this program at DEQ compares TRVs to air concentration data from DEQ's air monitors. Air monitors capture contaminants from a wide variety of contaminant exposure sources, including sources like vehicles and wildfires. And these TRV comparisons allow DEQ to assess health risk from air monitors around the state. In addition, DEQ's Cleaner Air Oregon regulatory program also uses TRVs to generate risk-based concentrations. These are called RBCs, which are a key component of the program's health risk assessments. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Mike to give a brief background on those RBCs.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Holly. Before we get into the RBCs, I always like to begin with just a basic discussion of risk. That is, that risk is a combination of the inherent toxicity of a chemical, that is, how bad is the chemical, and that's what Holly's been just addressing, and also the exposure, how much you contact the chemical, the concentration, the frequency, duration of time that you're in contact with the chemical. So this is a key concept which I will be coming back to a couple of times, that toxicity and exposure combine to create risk. Again, we'll come back to this in a bit, but first on the next slide, let's get a little bit more into what RBCs are. They are the regulatory values used in the Clean Air Oregon program. They're derived from the RBCs by considering exposure, and that includes accounting for different exposure locations and scenarios. We also incorporate exposure pathways in addition to inhalation for certain chemicals, and we account for some additional risk to infants and children for some chemicals that we consider important for that aspect. So next, let's get into a little bit more detail about that, although we'll save some additional detail for a bit later too. Okay, so here we'll add in a little bit more of the pieces here about the toxicity and the exposure aspects. Again, the TRVs, which Holly went over, describe how toxic a chemical is, and we have TRVs for cancer, chronic non-cancer, and acute non-cancer. And then we apply, in getting to the RBCs, we apply some adjustment factors to account for exposure, time, frequency, and duration. Again, some additional impact for infants and children, and also exposure through pathways other than inhalation. So these adjustment factors that we use are tied to the exposure scenarios. And those scenarios include residential exposure, worker exposure, schools, daycare, and also acute exposure, which would be more limited, like, say, park use, something like that. So considering both the non-cancer and the cancer effects for those scenarios, plus for all the chronic scenarios, the three of them there, plus non-cancer for acute. We only look at acute for non-cancer, not cancer. Those can total up to, in some cases, 7 RBCs for a chemical. And these factors are, if we go to the next one, is for the exposure time, frequency, and duration. Next, please. Those are our non-residential adjustment factors. And then for early life exposure, that we call that ELAF, early life adjustment factor. And then finally, multi-pathway, next please, is the MPAS. So those consider the chemicals that deposit on soil and accumulate over time, so that there are pathways other than just simple inhalation. So we'll look in more detail about these adjustment factors after this introduction. So this part now kind of completes the introduction to the 3 main elements of our proposed revisions. And next, JR will discuss some more about the rule update process.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Holly. And actually, next we'll pause for any clarifying questions. So I'll turn that over to Ben.
Yeah, thank you. So let's do exactly what JR just described. We'll pause for any clarifying questions. Dr. Kohlberg?
Yeah, maybe I missed it, but I'm interested in knowing how co-exposures, people, for example, who are breathing a lot of diesel particulate and maybe benzene at the same time, and how those two interactions can actually increase risk, and whether that is taken into consideration at all, because that's actually more the usual situation than someone breathing just benzene.
Holly, is that a you question? Yeah.
Yeah, I can start that off. Thanks for asking that question. And you're right that people are exposed to chemicals not just one at a time, but oftentimes is a big mixture of multiple things, and they can interact with each other. For risk assessments in developing TRVs, they're most often and really, it's really common for these TRVs to be developed one at a time for a chemical. Through toxicology research studies, they're applied to that one chemical, and then we're given information to evaluate the health risk. And then we can evaluate health risks on the back end, like Mike was saying, and we can then add up all of the different health risk from the different chemicals that people are exposed to in a mixture. So that's traditionally how health risk is applied using TRVs. So all the toxicity information we're getting from our authoritative sources is all one chemical at a time TRVs. With that said, you brought up diesel. Diesel particulate matter is the one exception to this that we'll be talking about in these proposed rules through these RAC meetings, where it's actually capturing and talking about a very complex mixture of exposure. And there's acknowledgement through recent science of that mixture with all those different components of gases and particulate can lead to lung cancer. So it's definitely a consideration and something that is most often you'll see taken into an account during risk assessment phase with these individual TRVs for an individual contaminant. But diesel is the one exception where we're looking at a mixture with the TRV. Does that help?
Mike, did you want to add first, and then Dr. Kohlberg will come back?
Well, I think Holly covered most of that there.
Okay.
And as we get a little bit more into detail further this morning, you'll see that the RBCs, the risk-based concentrations that we come up with, make it easy to sum the risk for cancer risk and non-cancer risk.
Good, thanks. Dr. Kohlberg, yeah, jump in.
Yeah, summation doesn't necessarily capture potentiation, though, when you have an interaction between two toxics that actually increase the toxicity beyond their sum. And, I guess that's another concern of mine.
All right, thanks. So, Holly, do you have guidance around how folks should kind of hold what Dr. Culber is describing as we go through this process, or maybe in the next part of our presentation?
Yeah. So I think I'll just add that piece of how you integrate these individual TRVs into combining them into a risk assessment is kind of like the risk assessment stage post TRVs. But what you're saying is true that sometimes when chemicals interact in a mixture, you can have things that are more impactful to health than if you just summed them. It can also be the opposite, where in a mixture you might have less of an impact. But there have been studies done, and most of the time the precedent for this is that it is health protective to do a sum of a mixture and health risk assessments. But that is something when we get to the health risk and implementation piece, we can definitely talk about. But that is definitely an area of toxicology under constant research.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Zilali?
Hi, yeah, I'm glad that Patricia brought that up just with like thinking. I'm a fan of holistic thinking. So I also am glad to see that there is the multi-pathway exposure adjustment factor, because what my question was going to be is if those other pathways are considered, and I guess if they are through that adjustment factor, I'm curious if there's any more background or context that can be shared about what that means for implementation. I know that there are other DEQ programs that address other pathways of exposure through land, water, food, and things like that. So I would like to know if there is ways that they can work together, and yeah, any more information on how those even though we're talking about air with the community with the Clean Air Oregon, I am interested in that more holistic way at looking at toxins. So thank you.
And real short answer is yes, we address that, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the next section.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks. Travis?
Yeah, I think it's also just important, and maybe DEQ and OHA can point this out when it's taken into account, is there are also multiple safety factors that are kind of built in along the way in different parts of this process. So I think understanding, when things are already have a safety net built in is good. So that we're not building conservative on conservative on conservative and therefore making a program that's overly restrictive. Thanks.
Thank you, Travis. Okay, not seeing any hands. Let's keep moving, and then certainly if there's more questions that arise for folks, we'll be pausing throughout this time together. So let's keep the content going, and then we'll pause again soon for questions.
Thanks, everyone. And I do I apologize, my internet is unstable, so if you could mute your video, that'd be great, to make sure I don't get garbled more than I already have been. All right, so thanks, everyone, again. So let's move into the presentation of what updates are being proposed for each of these three large pieces. So next slide. So similar to the health standards, it is important to update the priority list to reflect evolving science of toxic air contaminants, and for DEQ to maintain a current understanding of statewide contaminant emissions. So for this rulemaking, we are proposing to expand the list from 606 to 650 reportable contaminants. This expansion is primarily driven by needing to include tags with recently established TRVs, meaning that there is new information that these contaminants cause quantifiable health effects when inhaled, and we are proposing a new health standard for these pollutants. We also added a small number of contaminants of specific interest in Oregon. For example, newer chemicals being used as substitutes in the wood preserving industry. In all, this added 95 new reportable tags to the list. And a quick calculation from the information on this slide does indicate that adding 95 contaminants would lead to more than 650 contaminants on the list. This is because some of the other proposed changes to the list include organizational changes that lead to grouping of previously individually listed contaminants. For example, a specific metal-containing compound like nickel acetate is now reported under the group nickel and compounds. We've included notes for these groupings that assist sources in understanding how to report these contaminants in the document. And finally, we made minor structural and formatting changes throughout the list that do not materially affect the rules. I will now turn it back to Dr. Dixon to walk through the proposed updates to the TRVs.
Thanks, JR. So let me pull this up real quick. So you can see on this graphic here that we followed a multi-step process to review and update TRVs for proposal. So far, we've been working on reviewing and updating these TRVs for over 3 years. And in Chapter 2 of our supplemental document called the TRV support document that I'll show you all later on today, we provide a lot of detail about our 8-step TRV review and update process. Here, to try to keep it simple, I've broken this process into 4 main phases to talk about with you all today. And I also want to point out that while this graphic may look straightforward and simple, in reality, this was a very complex process that had many different components and projects within it. And all of these phases were very interconnected. So first, I'll talk about the 3 phases of work that you see here in blue and green. And this will take me a few minutes. And then I'll share more details about this 4th phase, ATSAC, on the next several slides. So let's start with phase 1. Here we set up the review process. And there are many sub-projects here. One example of that is we set up ATSAC. So this is that committee of experts on TRVs to provide input on our process and TRV proposals. Another example in this step is we had a process for members of the public to submit petitions to suggest TRV updates. This was called the petition process that you heard us mention a few minutes ago. We also here planned out the process for identifying candidate TRVs. And when I say candidate TRVs, I just mean TRV options from our authoritative sources. And this included integrating ATSAC feedback into that process before we proceeded with looking up information from our authoritative sources. Another project here is that we created a review tool. And this tool was helping us keep track of all the candidate TRVs in our proposals. It's important to note that there were no pre-existing resources that presented all the information we needed in the format that we needed it in. So this was a huge gap. And so we had to build an entire new tool for housing and organizing the TRV information that we needed, which took a lot of time. So then to move on to phase 2, this phase is identifying candidate TRVs. This is the phase where we recorded all the TRV candidates, those TRV options, from all of DEQ's authoritative sources. In addition to the TRV value itself, we recorded additional information for each TRV on how the TRV was developed and calculated by the source. And all that information was captured in our review tool. So as an example, we recorded information like exposure time in the key research study used to develop the TRV. And as you can probably imagine, this stage required a lot of manual data entry into the TRV review tool. We tried to design the tool to minimize risk of data entry errors, but there's still potential for errors. So DEQ engaged the services of Eastern Research Group, ERG, an independent consulting firm, to check each entry in our tool. So this means overall that every piece of data currently available in our supplemental TRV workbooks has been checked by at least 2 different people. Then moving on to phase 3 here, we selected TRV proposals. So once we compiled all the relevant information for all the candidate TRVs, we selected TRVs for proposal for each contaminant using the process and policies described in detail in Chapter 2 of our TRV support document. And ATSAC requested and informed all of these selection processes and policies that are listed in that support document. And zooming out overall, ATSAC feedback was a key part of this entire process and integrated into each phase of this work. And I'll give some more background on ATSAC at this time over the next few slides. So in 2021, the EQC, the Environmental Quality Commission, rescoped ATSAC to be an advisory body that provides advice on DEQ's TRV proposals. And in 2022, DEQ convened the current ATSAC. In our meetings with ATSAC over the past few years, we asked ATSAC to first review and provide feedback on the overall process for our TRV review and update process. And then second, bring attention to questions related to specific TRVs and groups of TRVs. So one example of a discussion prompt that we asked ATSAC was, what feedback or concerns do you have about the way DEQ proposes to adjust acute TRVs for exposure time? Each ATSAC discussion prompt then resulted in a robust discussion during an ATSAC meeting, and this is reflected in the recorded meeting and also the meeting minutes and in the written ATSAC responses after each meeting. In addition, in certain cases, we, OHA, highlighted specific TRVs for ATSAC to spend more time on. These include contaminants like diesel particulate matter, 1-methylnaphthalene is another example. But then in other cases, ATSAC members highlighted specific TRVs to us to discuss with the rest of the committee. So examples of those include TRVs like acetone and acrylane, for example. So on the next slide, let's talk about some of the rules around ATSAC. So Division 247, these Oregon administrative rules, specify that ATSAC should be composed of 5 to 7 scientific experts on the development and review of TRVs. The rules also direct DEQ to evaluate the qualifications of potential ATSAC members and the body as a whole by seeking professionals with skills in toxicology and or toxicity assessment, environmental and or atmospheric chemistry, and epidemiology/biostatistics. When convening this ATSAC, we prioritized candidates with experience in setting and updating TRVs. We also prioritized candidates that are or have been affiliated with our authoritative sources that are listed in rule. And we also took a close and careful look at conflicts of interest. ATSAC members are public officials, and as defined by Oregon Revised Statute, no member of ATSAC may have an actual or potential conflict of interest. So in 2022, the DEQ director appointed 7 ATSAC members with concurrence by the Environmental Quality Commission. 5 of these ATSAC members remained on the committee for the entire 3-year period and attended all the ATSAC meetings. And these ATSAC members I have listed on the next slide. And I'll keep this really brief. You can read a lot more about these ATSAC members in our support document. But all of these people are national experts on TRVs, and we feel really lucky that they volunteered their time to help us review and update these TRVs. This table includes their name and affiliation. And you can see here that the affiliations include the California EPA, the US EPA, Oregon State University, and Duke University. And each member's expertise aligns with what is required by rule. So on this next slide, I thought it'd be helpful context to kind of go over the dates and what we talked about at each ATSAC meeting so far. So as you can see here, we held 8 ATSAC meetings during ATSAC's term. So for background, in October 2022, we had our first orientation meeting with ATSAC. Here we shared background information, stuff like information about DEQ's air quality regulatory program, but also the purpose of ATSAC. And then we had our second meeting in January of 2023. And here ATSAC provided feedback to us on our plan for reviewing and updating DEQ's TRVs. And I'll add that this feedback was very helpful, and we made a lot of changes to our overall process in response to their feedback. So as an example, we heard from ATSAC that we should gather additional TRV information to inform TRV selection. So this is stuff like information on time adjustments that went into a TRV, and that we should capture this information in our review tool. So to address this, we then added all the requested information to our TRV review tool, for every candidate TRV that we found. We really appreciated ATSAC's feedback at this stage, and we carefully integrated all of their comments into the TRV review work since that meeting. We then had our third meeting in April of 2024. So as a reminder, the rules allow for people to petition DEQ to suggest updates to specific TRVs. This is that petition process. We received one petition on DEQ's TRV for acute inhalation exposure to manganese. And we care about manganese because exposure can lead to problems like respiratory and nervous system health issues. So at this meeting, we gathered feedback from ATSAC members on the petition. And the agencies, we came up with a proposal for this manganese TRV after we received and thought about ATSAC's feedback. And our proposal was greatly shaped by ATSAC feedback. We then had our fourth meeting in January of 2025. At this meeting, we prepared ATSAC to review all of our work on the TRV proposals. So at this meeting, we introduced them to 9 different documents, introducing them to our work, and 2 Excel workbooks. We then asked ATSAC to review these materials to prepare for the next 3 meetings. We had the next 3 meetings with them really close together in February. At these meetings, we listened to their feedback on our TRV proposals, materials, and discussion questions. And then we had an 8th meeting in May where we asked for ATSAC's feedback on the agency's cancer TRV proposal for diesel particulate matter. And diesel particulate matter, DPM, this is important because exposure is prevalent in Oregon and exposure can lead to lung cancer. So after that meeting in May, we then spent several months carefully summarizing and incorporating all of ATSAC's feedback into our proposals and the supplemental materials to prepare for this RAC phase of the rulemaking. So on this next slide, if you all want to know more about ATSAC and what happened at these meetings, I included this screenshot of the DEQ website that hosts all of the meeting materials. And you can find everything here from ATSAC. We posted all the video recordings of the meetings, all the ATSAC related documents. So that includes things like those meeting minutes that we wrote after each meeting. And also ATSAC members wrote down answers to discussion questions in written form, and those are all posted as well. And I also want to mention that to create a complete record, the meeting minutes and written responses, they're all appendices to our TRV support document as well. So you can find them if you download that big appendix document, which is on the RAC website, which we'll show you later. So on this next slide, I wanted to share a few numbers. I thought this would help to illustrate the amount of work that has gone into preparing and having these meetings, and also integrating feedback from ATSAC. So to prepare our proposals for ATSAC, we search for TRV information from DEQ's authoritative sources for each contaminant listed in the TRV review tool. So overall, we estimate that we searched documentation for about 20,000 data points, and we manually entered that information into our TRV review tool. Throughout that process, we asked ATSAC then to review 38 documents, totaling 469 pages. We have also had over 17 hours of ATSAC meetings across 8 virtual meetings. And we've compiled ATSAC responses to 60 detailed discussion questions related to our proposed TRVs. From a survey that we did of ATSAC members taken after the ATSAC meetings, the total cumulative number of hours that the 5 ATSAC members spent in preparation for and resulting from just the 2025 TRV proposal meetings was approximately 100 hours. And again, we're just very thankful that ATSAC members volunteered their time to provide us with this valuable feedback that really informed these proposals that we're moving forward through the rulemaking. And on the next slide, I want to talk about some of this ATSAC feedback and where you can find more information on it. All ATSAC members were generally supportive of the process that we followed, but I also want to say that ATSAC members provided a great deal of feedback that resulted in changes that we made both to changes to TRV proposals and how we displayed and explained TRV information in our OHA TRV supplemental materials. In terms of changes to TRV proposals, after the ATSAC meetings, we updated 113 TRVs across 70 toxic air contaminants to prepare for these RAC meetings. Of those 113 TRVs that we changed, 92% of them, a little over 100 of them, were changes in direct response to ATSAC feedback. And if you'd like more information, we prepared a document that summarizes all of these changes we made in response to what we heard from ATSAC. This is called Appendix A, and we'll show you a little bit later on where to download this. And this Appendix A is titled OHA's Response to ATSAC Feedback. And that's a very helpful document if you want to see how we incorporated and responded to everything we heard from ATSAC. So I have a couple more key numbers I wanted to introduce to you all, and these can all be found in our support document as well. So these numbers, they will change as we integrate feedback from this step of the rulemaking and other steps of the rulemaking process. But I wanted to share a current look at the number of preliminary TRV proposals. So overall, you can see here on this slide, there are currently 623 proposed TRVs for 377 contaminants in the TRV rule tables. As a reminder, each contaminant can have up to 3 separate TRVs. And now let's break down the pie chart that I put on the screen. So of these 623 current TRV proposals, about half, so 47%, of these TRVs are the exact same as the TRV adopted in 2018 rule. So in other words, 292 TRV proposals were retained from 2018. Then 32% of the 623 TRV proposals are new TRVs. This means that there was no TRV in 2018, and we consulted ATSAC on a new TRV. 32% here is equivalent to 197 TRV proposals. Then the remaining 21% of the TRV proposals are changes to the 2018 TRV. 21% here is equivalent to 134 TRVs. But overall, this pie chart, and why I put it together, it illustrates the importance of the TRV review and update process. The latest science published by our authoritative sources led us to recommend many new TRVs and make updates to existing TRVs. And as I mentioned, if you want to learn more about these numbers, we have a lot more detail and nuance included and have other outcomes of this review in Chapter 2 of our TRV support document, and specifically Section 2.3. And we'll show you where to get that document in a little bit. So on this next slide, I wanted to highlight as well that there are many instances where more than one candidate TRV was available from our authoritative sources. So specifics, there were 276 proposed TRVs where TRVs are available from more than one authoritative source. So as an example, we selected the proposed acrolein chronic non-cancer TRV from among 3 different candidate TRV options. And for your awareness, we have a supplemental Excel workbook where we list all the candidate TRV options, as well as the one that we're proposing to select. So I have one more slide. So in addition, there are 237 proposed TRVs where DEQ in consultation with ATSAC is the authoritative source. I want to point out here that there were no instances where we derived a new candidate TRV from primary research studies. The work with primary research studies is something we depend on other authoritative sources like the US EPA to do, and it is a very resource-intensive work. So these 237 proposed TRVs under this authoritative source category, they fit into 3 categories. So here, they're either unmodified TRVs issued by an ATSAC recommended alternate source, or they're modified TRVs from other authoritative sources, so like a modification to an EPA, ATSDR, or Cal EPA value, or it's a modification to a TRV from an ATSAC recommended alternate source. ATSAC encouraged OHA and DEQ to check alternate sources for candidate TRVs only in certain circumstances, such as when none of the other authoritative sources have a candidate TRV for a contaminant. And we have a lot more detail on this topic, and I have here at the bottom, so you can refer to later, but Chapter 2 and then also Chapter 5 goes into a lot of detail on this category, and it's something we had ATSAC spend a lot of time on as well. So I know that was a lot, but I was hoping that would give a good highlight on kind of the background of where we've been and what kind of resources we have if you want to learn more. So I'll pause now and answer any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Holly. John?
Hello. So, question for you on so we submit periodic state emission inventories for these toxics, and I was wondering how those were used in the TRV evaluation process. And I just think about, from an efficiency standpoint, you said you put a lot of work into these toxicology reviews, but if there are compounds that aren't even emitted in Oregon, did you exclude those from this? And then similarly, are you planning on removing compounds that aren't emitted from industry in Oregon from the list to kind of save y'all time in the future? So those are kind of the gist of my questions.
Thanks. I can take that one.
Thanks.
So thanks, John. Yeah, so we use the periodic statewide inventories, as you know, to kind of keep tabs on what those TAC emissions are like in the state and what is being emitted, what is not being emitted. So we do have built into our petition process the ability for the members of the public to request to request contaminants to be removed from the reporting list and the TRV lists. We use the sources that are in rule as well as, what's reported in the state to keep these, to generate these lists. So at this time, we did not incorporate in this rulemaking that analysis to remove any pollutants from either the reporting list or the TRV and RBC lists if they had not been reported in Oregon on those air toxics emissions inventories.
I guess as a follow-up, the 50 you said you added, are those 50 new compounds or 50 new TRVs? Sorry. And then I guess the follow-up would just be, are those known to be emitted in Oregon? I guess I guess I'm just asking, like, how do you make sure you're efficiently using your toxicologist's time, right? Like not wasting government resources, our time on compounds that don't necessarily pose a risk to the public.
Yeah, I think what my general response to that is that they are emitted in the US or California or Europe based on commercial industrial activities. They are known to have health effects, and this process is very time consuming and intensive, which is, we'll talk about later about adjusting the frequency. So it would be a lot harder to continually add those ad hoc than to make sure that we're being health protective and future forward casting for industries coming into the state that want to set up and do business here in Oregon, to make sure that we have the health protective values already on the books for us to assess the risk coming in, rather than having to do that each time a new business would want to come in to Oregon, emitting something that is known to cause public health effects. So I think for us, it's, again, that's why we rely on our authoritative sources, and we rely on those sources for the priority list as well that are in rule.
All right. And then Holly, there was a second part of the question. Did you want to answer that?
Was it about the numbers?
Yeah, there was, John, right? It was the 50 additional that were added.
You said, I think was it 50 new TRVs or 52 new chemicals you said were added to the list?
I'm trying to look at the pie chart. Make sure I get the right numbers here. I don't know about the 50. Is that the priority list that we're talking about?
I think so. Yeah, John, I think you're
Okay.
referring
Okay,
to
sorry.
the 50 that were added. And those are for wholly new TRVs is
Okay.
what that was. Yeah, I think it was 90.
Thanks, JR.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep, thanks, John. Other questions for this part of the section? Okay, do a last call. Okay, well, I think we're scheduled to take a break. Well, we take intermission, even better. Why don't we take let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10:52. Does that work? Okay.
Great. Thanks, Ben.
All right, we'll see you in 10 minutes, folks. Or Molly, did you want to jump in real quick?
Nope, all good.
Okay. All right, 10:52. All right, well, we're at 10:52. Mike, I see you're ready to go. If folks could put a thumbs up or some kind of reaction in the chat to know that we're back. I'm going to make sure Crystal and Jonah are those hands up just to let me know you're back. Yes, looks like. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. I see the critical mass. Mike, let's keep going. Just remember, folks, take your hand down. There we go. Perfect. So, the floor is yours, Mike.
Okay, great. As I mentioned, we're coming back to our foundational concept here that risk is a combination of toxicity, inherently how bad is the chemical, and the exposure, how much contact we have with it, frequency and duration. There are people on the RAC that are, highly technical. They know all this, and they can dig into. There's a lot of equations that go along with this, a lot of input values, and we welcome that scrutiny for those who are going to get into it at that level. But I do think it's really important that everyone on the RAC kind of gets this basic piece here, which is why I'm repeating it, about how we get risk, because that leads right into how we get the RBCs, which is the next slide. So if we have a concentration of a chemical in air, we can look at its toxicity and we can look at its exposure, and that's how we assess risk. Now, to get an RBC, we look at it as, rather than ask what is the risk for a given concentration in air, we could ask what is the concentration in air for a given risk level. And since our TRVs are based on, for the non-cancer, they're based on a level below which we do not expect to see the non-cancer effects. And for excess cancer risk, we use 1 in a million for our TRVs. We can use those risk levels and work these calculations backwards to get the RBCs. And going to the next click here, you'll see that if we pick a level as a non-carcinogen below which we don't expect harm, or for carcinogens at a 1 in a million risk, then what we calculate, the air concentration there, is our risk-based concentration. This is why risk is important. It's basically the same equations. We just run things backwards, picking these levels for risk that are not necessarily acceptable risk levels, because we have a variety of risk action levels in Clean Air Oregon. But instead, we're picking the meaningful and convenient values that are tied to our TRVs. So this, to me, this is like the big slide to take home, that here's how we get our RBCs. It comes directly from the long-standing approach for calculating risk. Okay, so next let's go on and look at the adjustment factors that we are using. So this is a more detailed calculation of how we get our RBCs here. So we looked at, Holly went through the toxicity reference values, and if you go next, you'll see that we had, remember, I'm kind of just reminding everybody that we had chronic for cancer, chronic for non-cancer, and also acute for non-cancer. Then we look at the, click again to get the exposure scenarios here. So we end up getting RBCs for each one of those exposures, that is residential, non-residential child, worker, and the acute level, which we can apply to any of the chronic scenarios, but also the short term, like a park exposure. So that we could end up, if we have both cancer and non-cancer effects in both acute and chronic, we can end up with 7 RBCs for some of the chemicals. And again, for the adjustment factors, we click again, we've got the non-residential adjustment factors, exposure time, frequency, and duration, the early life adjustment factors for certain chemicals, and also finally the multi-pathway adjustment factors for certain chemicals too. The non-residential adjustment factors, they have not been modified since the original, so that's all basically the same. even the early life, there's some modifications which we'll talk about in just a bit. Mostly the same. The biggest changes we have made are to the multi-pathway adjustment factors. Okay, so moving on to the next slide and focusing in on each of these areas now. So the non-residential adjustment factors, they were developed for original rules 2018 and not being revised. The residential RBCs are essentially equivalent to the TRVs, and that comes from the derivation of the TRVs. It's like constant exposure over a long period of time. Long averaging period for a carcinogen would be a 70-year lifetime. And also for non-cancer long period, but we include that basically a year or longer. For non-residential RBCs, those are based on reasonable maximum exposure assumptions. And again, there's details here, but just to show you a little bit of it, for the child, somebody at school, we're looking at 8 hours a day, 250 days a year for 12 years. Worker, somewhat similar, 8 hours a day, 250 days a year for 25 years in the workplace. We're thinking these are good, reasonably protective values. When we modify from the residential, that means that because they're spending less time, less frequency, less duration, the risk goes down, and therefore the RBCs will go up for those scenarios. And we're not, again, not asking the RAC to adjust, looking at the non-residential adjustment factors to review them. This is more just for context here. We will be modifying the other one, the ELAFs and MPAFs, which is the next topic here. Next slide. So early life adjustment factors are used because there's some carcinogens that harm a cell's genetic material and can have greater toxicity during early life stages. So we take that into it, and that's important quite a bit for certain chemicals. So we take that into account by using what EPA has provided for age-dependent adjustment factors to take into account that infants and children for certain chemicals are more susceptible to harm. And the authoritative sources we've used to update this chemical list. So let's take a look at a little bit more detail on that in the next slide here. The early life adjustment factors. So kind of the baseline for that is if you're exposed as an adult for 70 years, that the age-dependent adjustment factor is 1, basically is not adjusted. That's kind of the baseline is this chemical can cause cancer at a certain rate. And we don't have to modify that. But if you're exposed at an early point in life, like up to 2 years, infant in next year, that the impact for that early stage there is 10 times that of the standard adult for that period of time. So it has a greater impact for an infant and a young child there. And click again, we got exposure up to from 2 years up to 16. The additional impact there is 3 times. So what we take this into account again for certain chemicals that act by this, well, it's a mutagenic mode of action to get the cancer effect. So we can take this into account. We need to do some math here to time weight these to come up with these early life adjustment factors, which we use. And basically for residents, if you take into account this additional susceptibility, that means that the risk that we calculate is about twice that of an adult that would be exposed for an equivalent period of time. And for the non-resident child, schools and that the risk is about 4 times that of an adult, again, exposed for a similar period of time. So those factors are used to then modify the RBCs And because the risk goes up, the RBCs go down for the chemicals where we need to apply early life adjustment factors. Okay, so next slide, we'll talk about the multi-pathway adjustment factors. These were prompted in part by community concerns about, when we were doing rule development, that we look at pathways other than just inhalation. And that can be important for chemicals that either aren't going anywhere, like, not being modified, like metals and inorganics, that, lead's going to be lead until the end of time, and they can they get deposited in the soil. They're not like volatile chemicals that are just going up in the atmosphere and probably degrading, that they are being deposited to soil. So we're still looking at inhalation, of course, but we're looking for these chemicals. We're looking at the deposition that they have to soil, and then contact with the soil, additional pathways such as uptake into plants and then consumption of the plants. And these chemicals can be bioaccumulating, which means the concentration in your body just continues to increase with the additional exposure. So we look at that as an additional route of exposure to an infant through breastfeeding. When we were developing the rules in 2018, we wanted to include this, but there's a lot of work that goes into that. So the approach that we took came from the South Coast Air Quality Management District in California. They're a large agency, a lot of resources. We felt that they did a good job at coming up with protective assumptions there. Again, we don't want to ignore these pathways. We think they can be important for certain chemicals. So we included that. Our main updates now are revisions to what the South Coast had done, since a couple of things. One, those assumptions were made a number of years ago in South Coast. They were way ahead of us on this. But there have been some changes since then, and we've also had some time to dig deeper into some of the calculations. So as we look more closely at these assumptions, some of them we thought were perhaps overly protective, and others we thought were not sufficiently protective. So as we dug deeper in that, we made some additional changes, which let's look at those on the next slide. So our proposed modifications are, we wanted to focus for non-cancer, we wanted to focus on the age with the highest exposure. And typically that's a 2-year-old, say. Again, this is only for non-cancer effects. For cancer, we do look at long-term averaging times. But children that have higher contact with soil, they have incidental ingestion rates that are much higher than you would as an older child or an adult. And there's also difference in vegetable consumption rates. So both of those are elements of our multi-pathway. We looked at some details about root uptake to modify that from the original assumptions, and also gastrointestinal relative absorption for a couple of chemicals. We felt that, we have the opportunity, since we're digging deeply into the equations that are used, that we might as well update it to kind of the current risk assessment procedures for that. Okay, so next slide. We've got some of the proposed modifications are that for the non-residential child, and again, we want to be protective. That's our job as regulators. But so to simplify things, we just assumed that all these age groups would be appropriate because of daycare, elementary school, and so on. But we thought, well, in some cases, like if it's only a high school, for instance, with no daycare, then the assumptions that we're incorporating into the MPAVs, which then go into the RBCs for 2-year-old, say, contact with soil or other exposures, that may not be appropriate. So in those cases, we felt that, hey, we could, because we have, and we'll see in a bit, we have a spreadsheet now that makes all of these calculations fairly straightforward. And DEQ has had the scrutiny over both the equations and the input values, that would be a fairly simple for a facility to do a simple modification if they have an instance where there is a non-residential child, like again, like a high school, where some of the assumptions are inappropriate. We wanted to make that fairly straightforward. So we're putting that in rule that that you don't necessarily need to do a level 4 risk assessment in that case. Okay, moving on. Additional revisions to the MPAS. We added some more chemicals, makes sense. Since we had the opportunity, we separated the child and worker assumptions, which were just combined in the South Coast Air Quality Management District, where we took that. And the correct way to do early life is for each piece. And since we added that in the MPAFs, we're using the same concept, but we're doing it more precisely by incorporating it into the multi-pathway. We're incorporating the early life element in there. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's really quick summary of how we're modifying the TRVs to get the RBCs and some of the difference we made there. Key point is a summary here that RBCs are the regulatory values that we use in the Clean Air Oregon program. They're really the key goal. I mean, we need the TRVs. That was a huge lift. And the RBCs are basically our way, DEQ's way of applying those updated TRVs. And just to reiterate, we account for different exposures through non-residential adjustment factors, which haven't been revised. So we're not looking at the RAC to go through those in detail, but we do include new multi-pathway adjustment factors and some modifications to the early life adjustment factors. So that's basically it for that. Now I think turn it back over to Ben for any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So as we've been doing, just open it up for questions, reflections on that presentation. I'll do last call. Deborah?
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to ask, when you said you're adding new multi-pathway adjustment factors, is that for different chemicals than had factors in the past, or did you modify the factors from previous values?
Well, both. Yeah, both. We are modifying based on digging in deeper on some of the assumptions that were used for when South Coast did it, 20, 30 years ago whenever they first came up with them. But also, and again, we do the multi-pathway for chemicals that are long lasting and can bioaccumulate, that are going to be deposited. So, and there are more of those. So yes, it's both. We're modifying the MPAFs and we are adding additional chemicals and therefore had to generate MPAFs for those new chemicals. It's a considerably longer list. I forget how much, and depends on how you want to count it too, because there are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, but then we're listing each one of them out, that kind of thing. In just a little bit, I'll show you what the spreadsheet looks like.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Others? Okay, not seeing any. Let's keep moving.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Ben. Okay, so the final section here is a bit of a walk through the materials that are up on the website for assisting with the review for this rulemaking. All right, so next slide. As indicated in the charter, the committee members are required to review and provide feedback on all of the proposed rule changes. This includes the 3 pieces we've been discussing, the priority list, the TRV list, and the RBC, as well as some proposed rule language updates. In order to assist you in this task, DEQ and OHA have compiled a number of supporting documents to supplement your review that are available on the website. Again, you are not required to review and provide feedback on the supplemental documents, just specifically on the proposed rule changes themselves. And so this section will include a brief overview of these support documents, as well as the next step for committee members. Next slide. So I'm just going to talk about the priority list. So the priority list itself is available in both an Excel and PDF formats. And we've got these, the red line strike through, or which is basically the highlighted different colored text versions that you can see what changes were made. And if you oh, nope, it's all on there. Okay, so we've also provided an appendix to the list in spreadsheet format that serves as a user-friendly tool available for the public to use when determining which contaminant emissions to report. So this appendix includes additional information that is useful for sources when reporting emissions for a CAO risk assessment. In some cases, this might split out some of those groupings or provide more context on what chemical compositions would stick a contaminant in one reportable group or exclude it from a reportable group. And then finally, we've got a priority list supporting document, which provides committee members with more information on the rationale for making the proposed revisions to the list. So you can take a look there and see which chemicals were added, why they were added to the list, and how some of the groupings were changed, and then some of those more formatting issues and immaterial changes made. So with that, I'll turn it over to Holly again here to talk about the supplemental materials for the TRV review.
Great. Awesome. So as JR mentioned, we're asking you all to review the TRV proposals in the TRV rule table. In addition, we prepared some supplementary materials to help you understand how we generated these TRV proposals if you have questions. So there's two main categories of supplemental TRV materials that you've heard me talk about throughout this morning. The first one being the TRV support document, and then the second category would be the TRV proposal Excel workbooks. So next I'll show you where to find these materials. So for this first category, the TRV support document, this is a long document containing a lot of information. It has 7 different chapters and 20 appendices. And this support document is really meant to be a resource to help people understand the technical background and rationale for all the TRV proposals in this rulemaking. As you prepare for later RAC meetings, you could refer to this if you have questions about our processes or specific TRVs. But I want to emphasize that we do not expect you all to read and review this entire document. This is just a supplemental resource to help you understand these proposals as you have questions. We also did not intend for this document to be read from the beginning to end all at once. Rather, our intent here was to create a resource where you could jump around using Control Find to locate your answers. So next, we'd like to briefly pause and just show you how to find and download this TRV support document, and Dave is going to help me with the screen sharing part.
Great. Thank you, Holly. Let's see. Screen 2, share. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, it just loaded. I see the website.
Okay. I will also put the link to the link to this page in the chat when I'm done. But this is the page, the main page where DEQ's resources related to this Rules Advisory Committee are all found. And so if you scroll down, the main things we're talking about are in these accordion menus down here. So the actual rules that we're asking RAC members to comment on are in this proposed rules menu here. So those are those are kind of the main things that we are really soliciting feedback on from the RAC. This section that's called Advisory Committee Materials, these are the supplemental materials that JR mentioned and that Holly's talking about. And these within this menu is where you can find things like the TRV support document, the appendices to the document, the Excel workbooks that Holly has mentioned a little bit. She'll talk more about in a bit too. So I'm going to show you, I'm just going to screen share the actual TRV support document. And that will, yes, that will open up the, that will open this up. And the way, so this is what it looks like. This is the same title page that you saw on Holly's slide. I'm going to show you the table of contents. A cool thing about it is that these are hyperlinked. So from the table of contents, you can jump right to specific chapters that you might need. And we're going to highlight now the executive summary. So it should happen that when I click this, we'll jump right to chapter 1. And then I will hand it back to Holly to walk through this part. I'll keep screen sharing though.
Yeah, perfect. So this is that executive summary. So this includes descriptions of kind of everything that might be in this document. It's kind of nice, high level. And we think table 1-1 here might be especially useful to you all. So it's kind of at the end of this chapter 1. And cool. So we're looking at it right now. So let's take a look at the first row here. So it tells you what each chapter is called in this document, and then what you might want to find, what you might be looking for in each chapter. So looking at this first one, chapter 2 is titled Background on OHA's Process for Reviewing and Selecting TRVs for Proposal. And this table lets you know that you can read this chapter when you have questions related to rulemaking background, the TRV review and update technical process, and outcomes of the TRV technical process. Another example would be chapter 5. You scroll down. So you can see here, chapter 5 is titled Proposed TRVs where DEQ is the authoritative source. So you can read this chapter if you have questions about the calculations we followed for the TRV proposals where DEQ in consultation with ATSAC is listed as the authoritative source. And then if you scroll down, Dave, to table 1-2 right below, this is another table that talks about what are in all of these different appendices. And I think the main appendix of interest to you all will be Appendix A, which I mentioned before. This is titled OHA's Response to ATSAC Feedback. So I just wanted to highlight this one. And I think we could end the screen sharing, and I could talk about the workbooks real briefly for you all. We can go back to the slideshow. But we thought it'd be helpful for you all to see where the web page was and how to download some of these things we've been mentioning over and over again.
I just added the link to the web page in the chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. So we have these 2 Excel workbooks that you saw you can download from the website directly, and they accompany the TRV support document. We call them Workbook 1 and Workbook 2. These 2 workbooks, they share different information on the TRV proposals. So broadly, Workbook 1, this is just a broad overview of all the proposed TRVs. It includes information about whether the proposed value is different from the one in existing rule, and if so, a very brief reason for that change. So I could see that being of interest to you all if you're wondering how does the proposed rule differ from what's been in the rule in the past. Then Workbook 2 is a lot more in-depth. This has a lot more detailed information about how each TRV was calculated. So for example, you can find here information on the research study used to calculate the TRV. You can find original source documentation. So you'll see like links to EPA documents, ATSDR documents. You can also see things like if the TRV includes an exposure time adjustment or not. And this is that workbook where we highlight if there was more than one TRV option available, and we also highlight which one we selected. Again, I want to reiterate though, we don't expect you to review all these TRV supplemental materials, including these workbooks. These are all supplemental resources that may help you answer questions as they come up for you as you review the rule tables. But all this information in the workbooks went through our quality control process and was shared with the ATSAC. And if you want to learn more about the workbooks, there's a full description of them in our support document. There's also an info tab, the first tab of these workbooks, that includes a lot more background information and gives you tips on how to read and use each of these workbooks. And we're also, Dave and I are both happy to walk through these workbooks with you at the RAC office hours that JR will talk about a little bit in a few minutes. So, next up, Mike will review the RBC supplemental resources. But also, if you have any questions, I can take them now as well.
Well, and maybe Holly, just really quickly, just given the conversation at the beginning of the meeting, and I think it was slide 52, talked about feedback. And so could you define the type of feedback that, and maybe we'll get this later in our conversation, but the type of feedback that is expected in this process? And that might not be a Holly question, it might be DEQ, but just want to have confirmation around, like, when we talk about kind of reviewing all these materials, not just for your baseline knowledge, but reviewing these materials and providing any feedback. So JR, maybe that's a you question
No,
around.
it's a good question, and thanks for that clarifying point, because I think, and Holly, jump in here, but I think the supplemental materials for all of these are really meant to help enrich the conversations that you all can have with each other about the proposed rules. When we say feedback, the formal responsibility of the RAC is to provide feedback on the proposed rule language. I think here, because of there's a lot of information here, the supplemental materials will have information on the methodologies used for how we went about looking through the authoritative sources, how we went about moving through candidates to getting to proposed values. And that is an area where we can have robust discussions. And so that would, a lot of that information is included in the supplemental materials. And so in order to prepare for those discussions, if that is what you as a member would like to do, a RAC member, then I would push you towards those. But the actual formal feedback that we do look for out of the members is on the proposed values and the proposed tables and the lists, and then that language, those minor language changes that we're proposing.
Good, thank you. Mary, I see two of you, one in human form, so I'm going to call on whichever Mary wants to talk.
Yeah, because I can't use my video on my computer, so that's a technical thing on my side, not yours. I just, I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, and if I'm going to try the patience of the facilitators here, but kind of to that initial discussion, as you already referenced it, Ben, having gone through what you just went through, I just have to comment on what an incredible demonstration this presentation has been to the improvements in regards to the development and adoption of risk values that are the heart and the soul of the program, and generally for the Oregon's air toxics program. And so I just want to say, like, this is a huge improvement in the system in place that was prior to the adoption of Cleaner Air Oregon, where, to industry's concerns about not understanding, how things are how decisions are made. This has taken what was previously, by the previous, as the ATSEC existed prior to Cleaner Air Oregon adoption, was a very obscure and technically dubious decision-making process. And I just want to say, I think what we saw today from DEQ is a demonstration of, the improvements that following what the Cleaner Air Oregon statute had required is giving us in terms of understanding what's going into the decision making. So I just want to thank everyone for the work of showing this and kind of re-educating us on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. And I'll note, I did facilitate the ATSAC process and the additional resource. They had some pretty robust conversations that are captured in some of the meeting summaries and background documents, and some of the kind of technical questions that they asked to get to the place that we are now may be worth folks also reviewing. So just as a side note, anything to add, Holly, just based or to JR?
I just want to say to that point, I think everything from the ATSAC site has been migrated to the TRV supplemental document. So if they want to, they can go back and revisit those for sure. But I think Holly and Dave have done an excellent job of taking that and then summarizing the changes that were made,
that's great,
and incorporating all of that there. So we tried, they've done a really good job of trying to make it as user-friendly as possible. It's a lot of information.
Yep. Anything to add, Holly?
That's all correct. Everything, like the ATSAC meeting minutes, I think I mentioned, and the written feedback from ATSAC all came over as appendices to the TRV support document. And then that Appendix A incorporates all of our responses to that. We tried to be very thorough to create a very transparent document that will live on with this project as it moves forward, so that everything can be remembered. So we tried to put it all in one place together, but it's all online and available.
All right, thanks. Any other questions for this or reflections for this section? Not seeing any. Let's keep moving. We're getting to our time. So is it back to you, Mike?
Yeah, it's just a few notes, a few slides here on the supplemental resources we have for the development of the RBCs. Most of that goes to the empaths, a little bit for the ELAF. So we have, similar to the TRV, we have a support document that goes through, again, a little bit about the non-residential factors and RAS, but they haven't been revised. That's just kind of for context. And then, and since the question came up earlier about combining exposure routes, that's what the empaths do, right? If you inhaling a certain chemical, but it's also getting deposited in your backyard and your kids are playing in it and it's being taken up into your garden, we put all of that into the empath, which is then modifying the TRV to come up with an RBC that includes all those pathways for those relevant chemicals. So that's our way of getting accounting for all the different exposures that someone can get to. And then without really getting into the risk assessment, also the question about multiple chemicals, the way we set up our RBCs, if you're, say, talking about cancer, if you're twice the RBC based on a 1 in a million cancer risk, then your cancer risk is 2 in a million for, say, for chemical A. If chemical B, if you're 5 times the RBC, that's a 5 in a million risk. And we would look at 2 in a million plus 5 in a million, get 7 in a million for the combination of the, if you're exposed to 2 chemicals. So our, whole point with coming up with RBCs is to simplify the evaluation of risk. We're kind of doing all the work up front, all the risk assessment work up front here. So anyway, getting back to my main point here about the factors and the changes that we made in the multi-pathway. We have a document here which covers a fair amount of that, but there's also plenty of details in the empath spreadsheet tool that was developed by Eastern Research Group, the same consultants that helped us with the TRVs. They developed a spreadsheet incorporating the information from, again, you give credit for Cal EPA and South Coast Air Quality Management District, taking into account their guidance and on the updates that we've seen in 20 years since then. So that was used by DEQ, the spreadsheet, to calculate our empaths. The spreadsheet it documents all the equations that are used and all the parameter values. So again, it was for our use to develop the empaths, but we're making this available and open for everyone to review, and can also be used, as I mentioned earlier, for site-specific calculations where we think that might be appropriate. So going on to the next slide, show a little bit of detail here. There'll be a drop-down menu of pick your chemical, and then once that's done, it will do all the calculations and show what the empaths, the multi-pathway adjustment factors are. If you click again, you'll see that for each one of these scenarios, there'll be a backup tab that shows, again, all the equations, all the input values that are used to do those calculations. And another click will show that there's also tabs with documenting all the parameter values that are then pulled into the different calculations. So a combination of what's in the spreadsheet, all the, again, equations and parameter values that we're using in combination with a memo that describes some additional information about where values were taken, how they were used, and so on, that we're trying to be open, transparent about here's how we've changed this from our original assumptions of just taking values from South Coast and updating it, both updating the chemicals and updating in some cases the way the calculations are performed. So I think that's it for here. And next, I guess, JR, you want to talk about some of the fact sheets we have.
Yeah, and actually just want to put a finer point back on the empath stuff. I think to Ben's earlier point, the RBCs are adjusted from the TRVs. And so these empath numbers are not in rule themselves, but ultimately get translated to the values in rule. So I think there's no formal comment needed on the spreadsheet or the methodologies, but the conversation that we have here in the RAC meetings about these methodologies or these assumptions is what we would hope to have, because those do affect, again, the outcome for the RBCs that go into rule. Great. So okay. So in addition to those other documents, the last ones that I want to talk about here are, we have some fact sheets related to some of the foundational aspects of how the TRVs and RBCs are used to regulate toxic air contaminant emissions under CAO, and then also on cancer and non-cancer risk, as well as how hazard indexes are used in the CAO program. So these are brief documents, maybe a page or two, and they're intended for a general audience to give a high-level overview, maybe before you decide you want to dive into some of those more technical documents. And those are also listed in the RAC materials. So next slide. And so in addition to the materials developed by DEQ and OHA, we've also received technical information from one of the committee members already for consideration during the RAC process. We mentioned this in the earlier opening comments. Oregon Business and Industries has submitted some information for consideration during this process. So we will be posting this information on the webpage, and we intend to add these items to the technical discussions we're proposing for RAC's meetings number 2 and 3. And I guess I just want to open it here. If any other members have information or specific topics they'd like to consider for discussion in these subsequent meetings, please email those either to Apple or to the email address created for this rulemaking. Next slide. And finally, I did want to touch briefly on the implementation proposal that we've drafted for this rulemaking. At a high level, we're proposing to split sources into 2 buckets for implementation, and the subsequent actions they would be required to take upon approval of the proposed values once implementation begins. So the first group would be those sources, either new or existing, that have not yet begun a risk assessment under the CAO program before rule adoption. So for these sources, the proposal would be to follow the procedures in rule when they perform their risk assessments, and that they use the newly adopted values. The next bucket of sources are those that are either in the process of performing a risk assessment or have already completed one at the time of rule adoption. So for these sources, we are proposing that they would not be required to reassess risk using the revised standards until either their permit renewal or when a permit modification is submitted, whichever comes first. Our hope in sharing this proposal with you all at this kickoff meeting is to provide ample time for your review and preparation of feedback for a productive discussion during the implementation and fiscal impact meeting. And in addition to all of these materials, and because of the very technical nature of this rulemaking, DEQ and OHA will also be offering additional support for members. Next slide, please. We will be providing office hours for all RAC members. This will be dedicated time that members can schedule individually or as a group to meet with staff to understand the proposed rules and walk through the supplemental materials. This time will not be a forum for providing feedback or debating the technical aspects of the proposed rules or implementation. That should be done during the appropriate times in the RAC meetings themselves so that all members may participate in those conversations. We will be offering staff availability for these office hours beginning next week until a week before meetings number 2 and 3, but will require that members request specific times during this period to meet and ask questions. We do hope you all take advantage of this opportunity, as this is a technical rulemaking with many different aspects. You can request to schedule these times by sending an email to the contact email for this rulemaking, which we will share at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. And so the next steps for this committee are meetings number 2 and 3, where we plan on discussing the technical aspects for all the proposed rule changes and having those technical discussions. Meeting number 4 will be a space for discussing how these rules will be implemented, as well as serving as the Fiscal Advisory Committee, where you'll be asked to provide feedback on the potential fiscal impacts of these rules. Due to some internal issues, we needed to reschedule meetings 2 and 3, and we need to push those a little bit later out. And so you will be receiving a new schedule request for some time in the spring to finish out meetings 2 through 4. We do apologize for any inconveniences, but it was unavoidable on our end. I think, next slide, please. I think with that, we've got the contact information up here. So again, Apple Riberty is the Cleaner Air Oregon program coordinator and is handling all communications and running this rulemaking for us on our end. And then any email you send to Apple, please make sure you CC and include the caotrv.2026 email, just to ensure that any message you send makes it through to the appropriate people on our end. With that, it's been a ton of information we've thrown at you all today. As you can see, like OHA and DEQ staff have spent a lot of time putting together materials, and we are committed to kind of helping the members understand what they're looking at, what's important to look at, and how we need to have the conversations moving forward for those conversations, what information is important for those conversations. And I just want to turn it over now back to Ben for any last questions and wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, JR. And just from a scheduling standpoint, that will come from us though, right? Angela Hesenius, right? So folks,
Right.
I'll ask you in advance, keep an eye out for Angela Hesenius's email to help us get those on the calendar as soon as possible, knowing that folks' time gets obligated pretty quickly. Mary Pivotal, I see a hand up. Or is that your old hand?
Nope, actually, new question raised during JR's last presentation. So thank you. Clarification regarding the additional information, and I want to clarify that this will be all made publicly, but you reference a communication, some form of letter or document from OBI that I think would be really critical for all of us if that's going into the context of additional information regarding this rulemaking. And so I guess, to OBI's point at the beginning about, having a robust, transparent process, that is kind of a red flag, because I would want to see what that letter, what that information, what OBI is convening, communicating, and how that might then be visible in the final adoption of rules and recommendation to EQC. So will we get a copy of that? Will that be made public?
Yeah, yes, Mary, absolutely. So I think the reason we didn't kind of place it up on the RAC materials ahead of this call was because we wanted to introduce it before posting it, as well as offer to other members the same, to offer them the same ability to do that, to send that into us.
Okay, but you're also still saying you're not entertaining a new conversation around challenging the
I think
development, the technical or what went behind the development of these recommendations, right?
Right. I think what we do want to entertain is the ability for RAC members, if they do have concerns with some of the proposals, which are the rules themselves, to bring those up and discuss them here. I think the idea that I was trying to express is that sideboarding those conversations and trying to make sure that we keep this as a rules advisory committee discussion versus a technical advisory discussion. And, once we get out into those lanes of this is really deep science, DEQ and OHA need to take the comments from the RAC. Thank you very much. And we need to go back and determine, are we going to make updates to our proposals? Are we comfortable with our own assessments, or do we need to actually go back and talk to ATSAC before we make those revised proposals that go out for public hearing? So I think that's the kind of conversation that we're looking for. I guess I just wanted to sort of set the table that we're not expecting all of the members on this, this RAC to be able to delve into the minutia of some of the toxicological science, but we do want to allow folks to bring that up and flag that for our review.
Well, and though, I mean, I would be really concerned if there's an opportunity for this to have to be kicked back to ATSAC, and then that's a whole nother. I mean, we can take this offline, and I can avail myself of your scheduling opening. So thank you, but it is a red flag for me.
Thanks, Mary. And Charlotte, I saw you popped off briefly. Did you want to comment?
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, hence the reason it would have been better for there to be a public conversation. The ATSAC did its work in a publicly observable meeting, but it wasn't a public conversation. So I think that is the concern, that did not happen. And so now we're backtracking and needing to have a little more of a robust conversation.
Great, thank you. So let's go Jeff, then Dr. Kohlberg, then Crystal.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, DEQ, for the presentation today, and OHA as well. I mean, this is more of an observation rather than a question, and it's in part informed by Mary, your comment. This proposal will reshape massively the Cleaner Air Oregon program. There have been comments made previously and throughout this presentation by RAC members that this process was statutorily required. That is inaccurate. This is a regulatory process that was reflecting DEQ's rules, in which DEQ is required to complete a triennial review of the standards and to propose changes to those standards, quote, as appropriate. I think what we're trying to evaluate through this rulemaking and through technical comments is what is appropriate. Everyone here, I think, would be aligned around wanting to ensure that the Cleaner Air Oregon rules remain science-based. However, the manganese petition taught us that to be science-based is an extraordinarily complicated question, and it doesn't have one single answer. So here in today's conversation, we learned that there were multiple values being proposed to be set according to what authoritative sources have done since 2018. We also heard, and what the materials in the record reflect, is that DEQ and OHA have in some instances, in some special cases, see chapter 4 of this support document, gone on their own and gone beyond where the science is in terms of whether there are inhalation risks for, quote, special contaminants. The reason I'm speaking now is because I think it's imperative that there be a robust process around the establishment of the hundreds of new proposed values that DEQ, OHA, and ATSAC have considered. It needs to be transparent, to Mary's point. There's absolutely no reason why OBI's comments on the proposals to date should not be made public. However, there's no red flag in making that proposal for those discussions to occur, in my view. In my view, it's important that the science be considered to the fullest extent possible in this rulemaking. And with that, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And I think I heard JR, correct me if I'm wrong, the OBI submission will be shared after this meeting. And I think you all were waiting to make sure that the process and an invitation for folks to submit to and through this process, it was just coming afterwards. Is that accurate?
Right. Yeah. And okay. I do want to hit on some of the points there that Jeff made. I do think there were a number of candidate TRVs that were screened to get to the proposed TRVs. I think I would say that if you look through this document and if you take a look at the ATSAC process itself, there was a very robust process in place for that. I do think that ATSAC weighed in heavily on those to determine which of those candidates from which authoritative sources that are made it to the proposed TRVs. And then I think the other piece here, the characterization of going beyond the science, I think for many of these proposed TRVs where DEQ is the authoritative source, many of those are time adjusted. So for what this means is for the shorter, the acute, the 24 hours, there are times when the tox studies are an hour long or 2 hours long or a day long or 2 days long versus the time period that we're looking at for 24 hours. And this was all done, with discussions with ATSAC on making these time adjustments. I think all of that information is in there. And so I do want to highlight that this was, again, a very robust process done by OHA with DQ in consultation with ATSAC and also with QA/QC from Eastern Research Group. I think, to the point that OBI's information has been submitted, I think that's the information that in the conversations that we'd love to have. And so I think this is a place to have them. I'm just flagging that we might get to a certain bound on that, and then we'll take that internally, OHA and DQ, and assess what we do with that information after that.
Yeah, that's fair. So I'm going to go Dr. Kohlberg and then Crystal, and then just, I'm going to ask that we don't keep going down a path where we're asking to defend a process that happened, but for folks to be able to dive into what has been shared today, the resources and background, and know that there's additional information that you all can submit through DEQ that can inform some of our future conversations when we come back in the spring. But let's go Dr. Kohlberg and then Crystal.
Yeah, first, just this is an impressive amount of work that's gone into this process, and I want to honor that. And I apologize if my question is out of scope or too big picture, but I'm kind of sitting here wondering, are these RBCs something that are going to be applied to stack testing, to calculations of emissions based on throughput, to fence line, to ambient air quality? I'm trying to figure out the application of the RBCs when I think about this process.
Yeah, thanks. Mike, did you want to jump in, or JR?
Well, JR probably wants to add here, but risk-based concentrations, in order to get permitted, and again, we'll have risk action levels. So a facility needs to show that they will meet their risk action levels in order to get a permit, and again, there's other things about informing the public and so on. So the RBCs are absolutely applied to evaluate risk at a facility, and that's tied to the whole permitting process.
Yeah, JR?
Most of that is done through modeling of their emissions and then air dispersion. There may be some cases where there's actual air monitoring data, but the vast majority of what we're doing is modeling it from emissions and then determining whether or not they exceed the RBCs.
Jared, do you want to add?
That's exactly right, Mike. I mean, just a real quick breakdown, Dr. Kohlberg, is the RBCs are used for facilities looking at stack emissions and sort of taking those emissions in their pounds per, like 10 pounds of benzene per widget made. And we use those RBC, the modeling then takes it to a ground level concentration, and we use those different RBCs at different exposure locations around the facilities to add up that risk. So those are used for the regulatory aspect. The TRVs themselves, you mentioned monitoring and ambient
Oh, JR, we lost you.
Monitoring. There's a different, we set out across the state, toxic air monitors. And Holly mentioned
Mike,
this as well as toxics at different times. Oh, am I breaking?
yeah, you're breaking up, JR.
Rats. Let me add one more thing too, that the risk is evaluated at the location of maximum exposure, maximum risk for each of the scenarios. So maximum residential risk, maximum worker risk, non-residential child too.
Thanks. So I know, JR, you got.
No, it's good. The only
yeah.
thing I was going to say is that Holly touched on the TRVs being used by the ambient monitoring group. So that's really more looking at how do we interpret ambient monitoring data for toxic air contaminants in the state from wildfire or from some of those toxic monitoring stations we have around the state. So for the CAO program, the RBCs are really the regulatory mechanism.
Right, thanks. Crystal?
Yeah, thank you. Considering the ATSAC process, I just want to state my view on the importance of balancing public input with the science of the process. And I think there's a real strength in the ATSAC process because it requires that the participants don't have a conflict of interest. And I think it makes a lot of sense now to have that robust discussion and public input so that we separate the science from the implications of applying that science. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. And just, for ATSAC, they were very specifically directed not to think about kind of the fiscal, political, rights implications, and really just to focus on the science itself. Mary, is that an old hand or a new hand? It might be the sustained hand up, permanent hand up from Mary. That's old. All right, it came down. Any other questions, comments, reflections? Okay. Well, really appreciate this. I appreciate kind of the feedback that folks have provided, and we'll do some work behind the scenes to make sure both we're able to incorporate feedback and hear additional. I do encourage folks to utilize the resources that DEQ has laid out in terms of office hours. And then, of course, all of the kind of myriad references that the team brought in today. So in our last few minutes, maybe I'll ask just if DEQ, OHA, I don't know, Ali or Gabriella, if you have any high-level reflections or anything else that we want to do as part of our closing. Otherwise, we'll move into kind of ending the meeting. Ali?
Yeah, Ben, thank you for the opportunity. And folks, I really appreciate the engagement and your participation here. Look forward to your thoughtful input here in the process. We do want to engage you in the conversation. Please do take advantage of the office hours and get into the details with a team. They're making themselves available to you. It is really important. We're updating the data. This is CAO is critically important rulemaking that relies on good science, and I think I'm pretty pleased with the work that our team has done here. Just leaning into science, taking advantage of real experts in the field, listening to input that we've received, and sort of I think also focus on the implementation plan that proposal we put out there. So all of that is out there for you. Again, we're not rushing through this. Giving you plenty of time to consider this, hefty material that we put in front of you, and I apologize for that. It's hundreds of pages. We'll dig into it with as much as you want. So it's not a rush project, but we do want to get it to the finish line. So really, thank you for this. And, I don't know, Gabriella, if you have anything to say, but, again, I want to extend my appreciation here.
Thanks. Gabriella?
I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'll keep it very brief. Just echoing what Ali said and appreciate your patience as we walked through the large volume. The part of why it was so large is because of, the one thing just to put out a list of TRVs, and there's the rules, there you go. But it's as much work to try to put that into an accessible form through things like the supplemental documents. And we're ready to do more of that. We would need time for it, but we're ready to do more of that to make it accessible and for you all, support you all in your function of bringing to the agencies the information that we might have not considered. And that's, the central function of the RAC. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your engagement and time.
Great, thanks. And then there was a comment in the chat, Deborah, we will, yes, for the slides, meeting summaries, we'll have all the materials coming out of these meetings will be posted to the website. Okay. Well, with that, 11:57 on my clock, just a lot of appreciation. Look forward to seeing folks in the spring. Please, again, take advantage of the interim time to dive deeper, communicate with DEQ, use the email address that you see on the slide, attend office hours, all the stuff. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Appreciate everyone's energy and participation. Look forward to working with you over the next number of months. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.